This is the final part of the gender chapter, and it is a shorter presentation than the ones that preceded it. We are going to be discussing in this presentation the role of feminism and the three waves of feminism, as well as kind of what the future holds or how your chapter ends with its discussion on the future. So, one of the kind of primary forms of resisting gendered stratification has been the feminist movement, which we often talk about as if it's just one entity and one movement. But as your book made clear, there are multiple types of feminisms, and there are at least three distinct waves. And we're going to talk about a couple of those types and all three of those waves in this presentation. Um, Before we get started, feminist or the label feminist or the status of being a feminist, even in today's society, sometimes still comes with some negative connotation. And although there are more women who say they are a feminist, or at least more women who took the BuzzFeed survey than we have had in the past, there is still this kind of gap between men and women that label themselves as being feminists. And then even for those people who indicate that they are feminists, there exists an unwillingness to describe themselves as being a feminist to others, and this seems to be particularly true for the men who say that they are feminists. And so perhaps this quick discussion of the history of feminism and some of the misconceptions around feminism will help put these findings in broader context. So the first wave of feminism is tied directly with suffrage. And so it arose out of the abolitionist movement, which of course was the movement to end slavery. But a lot of people that were abolitionists also believed in the idea of universal suffrage. So the idea that everyone should be able to vote. What happened was there was some success on the abolitionist movement front, with the 13th Amendment being passed, of course, declaring slavery unconstitutional in 1865. And then the 15th Amendment was passed in 1869, which granted black men the right to vote. So at this time, women of any race were not permitted to vote. And so what we see between the late 1800s and the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which did grant women the right to vote, was kind of the first real feminist wave, activism, and picketing related to being granted this right to suffrage. And although there were some other concerns that these early feminists addressed, because suffrage was first and foremost for a lot of the suffragettes, which is what they were called, once they were granted that right in 1920, the movement and the wave kind of trickled out, at least until what we now consider the second wave of feminism. The second wave of feminism was jump started by a book called The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, in which she talks about the problem that has no name, largely this kind of unhappiness and unfulfillment that is felt by women who are primarily exist as being caretakers, homemakers for their spouses and their children. Um, and this was in the 1950s. And of course, the major criticism of that is that the type of women that were able for that to be their main complaint, this problem that has no name, this sense of dissatisfaction with their life, largely was just applicable to white middle class women. Almost all women of color, of course, worked, as well as this is the 1950s. They're also facing racism, so their problems had some really distinct names. And poor white women, of course, had to deal with issues related to class, and they by and large worked as well. So this was very much a kind of middle class white movement. But even among that group, there were distinctive types of feminism that rose out of this second wave. And so, depending on the type of feminist that you were, largely kind of largely influenced the types of issues that you focused on. So the issues that were kind of second wave feminist issues were things like equal pay for equal work, sexual harassment, the beginning discussions of like sexual violence and interpersonal violence, the redefinition of gender roles, increasing political representation among women, the experiences of women in college classrooms. All of these were kind of second wave feminist issues. The two major types of feminism that came out of this wave were the liberal feminists and the radical feminists. The liberal feminists largely wanted to ensure for women the same rights and freedoms that men enjoyed. And so, equal pay for equal work was a very large issue for liberal feminists. Making workplaces free from sexual harassment was a large issue for liberal feminists. Radical feminists, which although smaller in number, kind of became the face of the second wave feminist movement. And oftentimes the stereotypes that people associate with this time period, whether it's the bra burning, or whether it is, the some of the slogans like a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle. A lot of those types of stereotypes came out of the radical feminist movement, who weren't so much interested in ensuring equal rights for women compared to men, so much as a kind of complete redefinition of gender roles. This was really the first group of feminists that, wanted to tear down the patriarchy, and rebuild society in a completely different image. Liberal feminists did not want so much that as more of equal status, equal treatment within the society as it was. So that distinction between radical feminists and liberal feminists was a major distinction, and one that sometimes was ignored by media coverage that just kind of lumped them all together. Second wave feminism, unlike first wave feminism, didn't necessarily die out, but as they gained successes, in the 70s, everything from women being able to get, mortgages and credit cards and bank accounts in their own name. You had the passage of Title IX in 1972, which really increased the number of women that were on college campuses, as well as the number of women playing sports activities. They never were able to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, but they certainly gained a lot of support for it in some states. So as they made these gains, the movement itself kind of became less populated by people that were directly involved in the movement. But certainly some second wave feminists still do work in the area even today. A good example is Gloria Steinem. But at some point, and the third wave is less clearly correlated with an issue or a time period as much as the first and the second wave are. At some point, the second wave feminists gave way to a younger, more diverse bunch. And roughly that time period is the 1990s. And this third wave, the focus was on, how different people do gender and that there are many different ways that one can be a woman. Compared to the earlier waves, it was purposefully much more multicultural and intersectional. Um, and it was the first wave to explicitly kind of embrace men as being feminist as well. So a lot of the younger celebrities, certainly a lot of the male celebrities that you maybe have seen speak or have heard them or seen a quote attributed to them about feminism, a lot of them come out of this wave, right? The idea that there are many different ways to be a woman and that women's lives are not uniform, and they are, in fact, it's important to consider intersections with class, with race, with immigration status, with disability, with sexual orientation, because all of that, of course, impacts how a person does gender. So that's kind of the focus of third wave feminism. But certainly not everyone is a feminist. And so at every single wave, there's always been an anti feminist counter movement, whether it's people pushing back on the idea that women should have the right to vote, or people pushing back on the idea that, men and women deserve equal treatment in the workforce or equal opportunities to attend college. The current kind of counter movement, the men's movement, Menist, they point to the successes that women have and say that it has come at the demise of men. And so there's often a concern, of course, that as women ascend, that men will that it's a zero sum game and that men will do worse, and that we need to be more concerned about the status of men. And even for people that aren't necessarily what we would consider to be anti-feminists, as I started this presentation off with, there are just these stereotypes associated with feminism. That means that while a lot of people might agree with the actual kind of basic tenet of feminism that women deserve to have the same right and opportunities as men, they might reject the label because of those stereotypes of hating men, or wanting to be superior to men, or well, if you want some examples of other stereotypes, I give you a link there to a video from the Sociological Cinema website. Um, but as we go into the future, considering all of the information, kind of a couple of key takeaways. Gender stratification does still exist across most sectors of society, in terms of women actually exceeding men. Uh, so far, just the higher education sector is the only real sector in society that's seen that trend. Women are still lagging behind men in a multitude of ways in the labor force, and with things like the motherhood penalty, which are just tied to reproduction. It is unlikely that this is going to dramatically change overnight. Political participation and representation for women is increasing, but once again, it's unlikely we'll reach parity anytime soon just because of that distinct lag between the Republican Party versus the Democrat Party in terms of successfully electing women to hold positions. And of course, it remains to be seen, when we will join so many other nations in the world and having had a female head of state, as that has yet to happen. Um, so it's a mixed bag in terms of successes and progress and how far we have left to go. Certainly, what the future holds for our gender map, this rejection in the last 7 to 10 years of the binary, and the kind of openness with which society is acknowledging people who do not fit the binary means that we are unlikely to go back in time to a world where our gender map just consist of the terms man and woman. Certainly, some of the terminology that's floating about now might fall out due to lack of use or the creation or construction of a better term. But what we will have in the future is it will probably continue to be this very expanded definition of gender. And that is it for chapter 10, as well as, of course, that little bit of chapter 3 that I threw in there. So this is the final presentation.